Halloween must be just around the corner because I've made another apothecary. This one is a mini version packed with books, bottles, steampunk goodies, and more. If I haven't tempted you before with my apothecaries, maybe this time I will. The base of the cabinet comes in a chipboard kit, which makes it very easy to assemble. At the top, you see I've laid out the pieces so you can see how they fit together. It's really pretty simple. Each end's exactly the same, and then you've just got this center box. And if you look below, you can see where I have assembled it, glued all the pieces together. And then in the lower right, you can see how this box looks like when it's closed. And one of the things I want you to notice on the last picture there is how the tops and the bottoms of the sides go almost completely on top of the box in the middle, because that's going to be important later when I talk about how I'm covering this. I decided that I wanted a combination of paper and paint, and the first thing I did was paint all my edges so that they'd all be black and dark, and no matter what you do with the paper, fitting it together, a lot of times you just see that little edge of white on the paper. And I do always ink the edges of my paper before I glue them down. And in this case, it was Distress Ink, the Ranger Distressed Inked Black Soot. And then inside, of course, I painted every little corner inside, everything on the outside. But I also want to call attention to the top there. In the previous picture, I said pay attention to the fact that those end pieces go on top of the middle piece. My concern is that if I've got paper going on top of paper, it may be a little too tight. And also with the rubbing, if you're going to open and close that frequently, or maybe even at all, I don't want that the sides to end up tearing up the paper that's on the top of the middle section. So if you look at those red arrows up at the top picture, I've painted the top inside and the bottom inside of those side pieces black, and that's what they'll be. They'll be black. They won't have any paper. So that way, as those open and close, when they go over the paper that's on the outside of the middle box, it won't tear it up, and it won't be too thick to close. So once I got all the painting done, then I papered the outside of the boxes, not the inside, and I'll show you why in just a minute. Now you have some options with the box. You could choose to hinge it together. You could hinge it together just so that it stays open and it just looks like it closes and opens. You can hinge it and have it be a functional hinge where it opens and closes. Or you could just glue the edges, the outside pieces to the center piece, either at an angle or flat across. It's up to you. I'm actually making a functional hinge, so one of the reasons I had you, or the main reason I had you not paper the inside, is once you attach the hinges and you attach the latch, you'll have these prongs from the brads, and you don't want to see those once the inside of the box is done. So we'll leave the paper off the inside and wait until you put on your hinges, you put on your latches, whatever you're going to poke through the box, and then once we get that done, then we'll come in with paper on the inside and it'll cover all that stuff up. So at the top, on the right or left, excuse me, the very shiny hinge. The trick with this box is you've got to get a hinge where when you fold the hinge over the edges of the box, that the holes are far enough away from the edge. And so you need a pretty big hinge, not because you need it for support, but just so that those holes will get past the edge of the box. And in this case, I actually only used 2 of the holes because I felt like the hole that was close to the hinge was maybe just too close to the edge of the box. And so first thing I did was put my box together and hold it together, and then lay my hinge over the corner of the box or the edge of the box, and then I marked with a red marker where the holes were going to be. And the next picture you see I've punched the holes, but not the one next to the hinge. And in the next picture you see I've actually painted the hinge to get rid of all that brassiness. And then I've added the 2 brads through those holes, and then inside the box I've opened the brads to hold it in place. Now I also use glue as well. If you don't use glue, then those holes and those brads, the hinge will move up and down in those holes. Even if that brad's pretty tight, you will still get movement. And so then you'll have the center of the box and the edges of the box moving in different directions. So I glue that hinge down first, and then I stick those brads through and then fold them and of course let that dry. And I did it to the outside pieces first, and then I attached the other side of the hinge to the big box, that goes in the middle. And the next picture, you can see how the hinge is now on both sides of the box. And of course, there's 2 hinges, one on each side. And then to cover the hole, I just took a brad and clipped off the tongs and just glued it on. So it's just a faux brad, but it covers the whole of the hinge. And then you've got, I decided I'd have the closure would be what you see here. And I went through the same process. I just laid that on the box with the box closed on the front and marked my holes, poked my holes through, and then added the brads and then opened the brads inside. Now we're ready to work on the inside of the cabinet. And you can see by the top picture that it's got paper. Now the difference in the color was just the lighting, that the color that you see for the shelf and the color of the bigger picture above, just the lighting that I took the picture in. And so now I've papered all the surfaces inside except those 2 surfaces, the top and the bottom of the inside of the ends, where I just painted those black because I didn't want them to rub on the paper. And then I cut a shelf, and the shelf is 8 by 7/16 inches and 2 3/4 inches deep. And I used 2 layers of heavy chipboard. You could also use a piece of foam core. I say use heavy chipboard because you don't want any kind of bowing in the middle. Even if you did a bunch of thin chipboard pieces, I'm just afraid it just won't be sturdy enough. So if you can get your hands on some heavier chipboard, and or foam core if you have that, because that's really nice and stays stiff. And we don't have to attach it to anything because the cabinet, the shelves that you see, and the book on the other side, that is the support for that shelf. And so the cabinet is made out of matchboxes, these little narrow matchboxes that Alpha Stamps carries. And all you do, this is one of the first videos I ever made, was how to put these cabinets together. So if you've never seen matchbox cabinets before, you can watch my first video. So I didn't want to go into a lot of detail because that thing's too long. 2 pieces of it are very long. So basically you're just gluing them together in a stack, and then to keep them square and to give them support, I glued chipboard all the way around on each side and the top and bottom. When you do that, the picture doesn't show the drawer in, but you need to leave the drawer in there. So make sure as you're gluing them together, and then as you put the chipboard around it, you do have the drawers in there so that they don't collapse on you. Now you do not need to put chipboard on the back or the front because you'll not see the back, and you've got plenty of support with having something on the sides and the top. So once I added that chipboard, then I wanted to make it pretty, and so I covered the side with that you're going to see with some faux leather paper, and I've used that also on the book that you see. And on the book, I've just covered some chipboard. I'm going to show you later how I made all the books, but I just covered the book. I just had a bunch of pieces of chipboard, put that leather paper on it, bent a piece of filigree on it and around it, and then stuck on a spider. And I just made that book the height of the bookcase. So now that gives you really great support, and you don't have to worry about what you put on the top. Now I want to talk about embellishing the front of the cabinet. What I did was I used some dragons, and at the top left you can see it's just a chipboard sheet with a bunch of different dragons on it. So I chose 2. And of course these are flat chipboard. There's no dimension to them whatsoever, no texture to them. So that's what I decided to do, is I wanted to add some texture. And as you look at these 2 pieces, you probably think, oh, this looks awful. This is just a mess. But it does turn out into something really good. At the top, what I've done is I want to create some structure in the wings, and also just on different parts of the body, like the tail area and then going up towards the head. So I'm just gluing fiber down. That's all it is, just pieces of fiber. And they're fairly thick fiber because we want it to bump up quite a bit. And now I want to actually add texture to the chipboard as well. So once I glued that fiber on, then I used the stone spray. I use this stuff all the time it's really great for architectural stuff. And if you watch my Ghost Moor Manor video, then you saw me use that. And I've used it on some other projects as well. So then I just sprayed that on. So that gives it kind of a gritty, bumpy texture to the dragons. Now the third component to the texture are eggshells. And I did a whole tutorial on how to do faux book or whatever with all these eggshells on it. And so I decided that would give me that scale look, and I only wanted it on certain parts of the dragon. So I just glued it to the chest area and then going up the neck. And I didn't piece those in. If you look and you think, oh gosh, you glued each one of those down one at a time. No, I did not. What I did is just put some glue down, and I just took a big piece of eggshell and just pressed it down onto the surface of the dragon. And do not worry if it overhangs the edge of the dragon. That's just fine. You'll clean it up later. Just leave it there because you don't want anything to, if you're trying to clean it up and it starts to lift off, or just wait till we paint it. So anyway, I just put it where I wanted it and then just smashed it down there, kept smashing it and making it smaller and smaller. And then after I got done doing that, then I actually painted the dragons black. And you notice now all the ugliness of the fibers and the eggshells and the gritty stuff and all is all erased, and all you have now is texture. And then at this point, I took me a couple of coats of paint to get it on. And at this point, now I went back in and cleaned it up. I flipped them over to the other side so I could see where the actual shape of the chipboard was, and snipped things away with scissors, and then used sandpaper to sand off any little edges or bumps that needed to be cleaned up. So I just got it, just like I wanted, all cleaned up, and then painted solid. Lastly, it's time for the finishing touches, which is color. And if you watch my videos, you know I love Gilder's paste because it's so easy to apply a little bit of it. You could use paint too and just kind of barely brush it on with your finger, but I just love how Gilder's paste works. And so I started by covering the entire dragon with the gold, the Inca gold, and then I went back in with the vertebra, which is the green, and I just rubbed parts of the dragon. I did the stomach, some up into the face, and then some on the wings of the dragon. And so there is the finished textured dragon. Now you can see the front of the finished cabinet, and I decided it needed some more structure to it since it's so boxy. And typically I would add things to the top, pediments, things like that, that would give it some height and some interest. But because of the way the box closes, and the side piece is going on top of the middle piece, there really isn't much room to do anything like that. So if you aren't going to close yours and you're just going to have it open, then of course you could do something on the top and you wouldn't have to worry about that. So what I've done is I've used some frames. If you look at the lower left-hand corner, this is one of my digital kits that has lots of different kinds of frames in it. And so I picked one of those frames and I printed it a couple of times because I wanted to cut out pieces of it and glue it on top or pop it out on top of the main frame. And so the top molding and the bottom molding is cut out and it's on top of the main frame. And you can't see it as well in this picture as you do in real life, but there is a lot of dimension to the frame. Then behind those frames, I've used a faux black suede, which is a really, really pretty paper. You can see a picture of that down below. And then I've put the dragons on top of that, and I popped them up with a couple layers of foam core tape. Couple things to think about. Make sure that you do paint the back of your dragons, green or black or whatever you're going to do, just so that if you see the box from another angle, you're not looking at yucky chipboard. And then something I also do to kind of hide the foam core tape, because you might get little peaks of that, is I paint the edges of the foam core tape black or a color that matches with whatever I'm doing, so you don't get that white popping out as if you see it from angles. For this apothecary, I made a lot of books and a lot of different kinds of books. And I'm going to start with the simplest of the books. I've got 2 new collage sheets with this project, and they have several books on them, book covers, book spines. And basically what I did is cut a lot of these out and then fold them so that, they're in the shape of a book. And then on the inside, I just ink it. I usually use the Vintage Photo Distress ink on the inside edges so that if you see edges of the book on the inside, the paper isn't white. And then I simply cut pieces of chipboard that are slightly smaller than the book cover itself, and then glue those together, and then paint the edges, and then glue it into the book. So very simple way of making a faux book. If you're not going to open it, there's no sense in just cutting out a jillion pieces of paper to try to fit into a book like that. So chipboard is kind of a fast, easy way. So below you can kind of see the Black Hat Society book, and then I've got the chipboard that'll fit inside that. And then you can see on the other picture below, you can see where I've just painted it. I usually start with kind of a darker cream color and then and coat it pretty good, and then come in with a lighter color and just kind of dry brush that on, just so it kind of looks old and you know, kind of messy. Another thing I did was make books out of paper. And so the first set of books that you see that are strapped together, that is just some texture paper from my stash. And same thing, I just covered some pieces of chipboard, and then I used that faux leather paper that you saw at the beginning that I used for the bookcase, or the drawer, the little cabinet. I just cut strips of that, and so that way it looks like it's bound with leather. And then there's these two metal pieces that are the go on top of that, so it really looks like it's strapped with a buckle. So I thought that was cute. And then on the other side, I've used first of all, I've used that same black paper, the suede paper, and then the leather again, and just covered some chipboard, and then put some things on the ends. The silver is a sticker, and then there's a silver charm bat on top of that, and then the other book is the one that you saw me use as support in the for the shelf in the cabinet. Now here I have a little bit more complicated book, and it's a book that has a bottle inside of it. And I've seen these all over the place. Different people have made them, and I think they're really cute, so I thought I'd give a try. And I've kind of laid out the steps for you here, but the first thing I did was just choose one of the book covers from the collage sheet. You could do that if you have that. If you don't, just make your own cover with paper. And you want to cut enough pieces of paper that will fit snugly in the book so that, you know, the book closes and is full. And then you want to take, after you cut however many pieces of paper you need, and it doesn't matter what the paper looks like, just take about 10 of those pieces of paper and put them aside. And then I wanted a way of making it faster to cut this hole, because you know, cutting a hole in 100 pieces of paper, however many pieces of paper it was, to fill this thing would take forever. So basically I grouped the paper into groups, glued them together like 3 or 4 pages. And the number of pages you glue together depends on your cutting method, but that was pretty good for my heavy scissors. And then I made a template. So I took a piece of chipboard and made a template and cut the hole the size I wanted it for the bottle. Of course, that depends on the size of your bottle. And then I used that as a template, and I just laid it on top of each grouping of paper and marked the hole. And then to cut those, I used my big heavy hole punch to just make a bunch of holes in the middle of the area I needed to cut out. And then that was a starter hole that I could use to get my scissors in there and actually cut the hole out. Now you could also use a box cutter and a ruler and cut that out, just kind of however you want to do it. I didn't try to make it perfect or, you know, everything symmetrical. It was just kind of a rough cut, rough hole. I liked that better because I thought it looked more distressed. And then once you get that pile, once you've got all your holes cut in your paper, then you've got those 10 pieces of paper that you put aside, glue those together. Then I decided to put a decorative piece of paper on that from another collage sheet. And then I glued on all those sets of paper that had the hole cut in them. And then I glued another decorative piece of paper on top of that I cut a hole out of. So now you've got that stack. You've got the full pages, which those are the ones that are going to go against the back of the book and you know, support the bottle. And then you've got all those pages with the holes, and then a decorative page with the hole. And of course you want to make sure that your book is deep enough that you can get the bottle that you want in there. Now I inked the edges of the paper because it was white paper, as you can see from the top picture. So I inked the edges and all before I glued this in the book. Then I glued that whole stack in the back of the book, and then I glued that to the spine so that the book was tight. And then to the front of the book, on the front cover, I just used another one of the images from the collage sheet. And then basically glue your bottle in the hole, and I've just got some alcohol ink in it to make it red. And make sure that whatever you put in your bottle, that it's dry so that it doesn't leak out into your hole if you lay the book down or move it around. So it's a pretty simple process just to create a little book with a hole for a bottle. Since I was making books, I decided I would do a miniature version of my eyeball book with the tissue paper texture. That's another tutorial. So I'm just going to go over the highlights of it because it's the full tutorial that goes through it in excruciating detail. So here I'm just going to miniaturize it. First I cut 2 pieces of chipboard, and then I cut a strip of paper that I would use to marry the 2 pieces together and create my spine. And then once I did that, I glued an eyeball onto the cover, wherever it's going to be the front. And then I just tore apart tissue paper. When I say tissue paper, I don't mean Kleenex, like as in blow your nose tissue paper. I mean tissue paper as in packing presents, things like that. So I tear it up into little pieces and crumple it all up. And then you want to glue it onto the front surface of the book. And I usually use Mod Podge, but I didn't have any, and I didn't have time to go to the store and get more. So I basically just thinned out my paper glue, which is Tombow Multi, and just added some water to that so it's thinner, and then just painted the book with that, and then started sticking down all that tissue paper. Now, you don't want glue just under the tissue paper. You also want to go over the top of the tissue paper to help glue it down and also to kind of create a seal for it. And then you want that paper to stick out over the edges, because you're going to want to fold that paper over the edges to the inside, because you'll see a little bit of the inside and the edges when you look at the book. So you don't want the paper to abruptly stop at the edge of the book. So after like sticking all that down and then going over it again with some more glue, I just set it and let it dry. You might also want to notice with the eye, as I had done before in the other book, I kind of put the paper around the eye over the top in a kind of twisted up some long pieces and wrapped it around the top of the eye and the bottom of the eye so it looked more like an eye socket. Now here you can see that I have wrapped the excess paper around the edges. Everything is dry, and so now it's time to put your colors on. I chose to paint this with a gray acrylic paint, and then I went over it first with a little copper Gilder's paste and then a lot of gold Gilder's paste. But I didn't go around the eye, kind of left that area untouched with the gray. I thought that kind of made the eye pop a little bit more. Then you just want to fill it with chipboard. Chipboard that you've cut, stacked, and painted the edges, and just glue that in there. And now you have your book, and you can embellish it how you want. I decided to add some kind of steampunk sort of closure. I figure any book with an eyeball on it's got to be scary and maybe needs to be locked up. So I've just added, it's all clock pieces, and then I've just added a gear and then this little handle turn type thing. I think it's a Tim Holtz thing where it comes in a whole package of those. So that is my eyeball book. Okay, I'm going to show you now how to make this little miniature book with the potions inside, the spells, enchantments, all that kind of stuff. And what we're going to do is, I first started by choosing a book from one of the collage sheets. Not every collage sheet fits the size of the potions, but several do. And this magic one does, so that's the one I'm going to use. Now, if you get a digital set of all this, or any of this, then you can size it and change it, so it can be whatever size you want it to be. So I started by cutting out the magic book, and then I'm going to fold it where it looks like the spine should be. And then on all these books, I'm inking the edges. I'm pretty much using the Vintage Photo Distressed ink and just doing it all around the edges here, just so whatever part of the book you see that's not covered, you will get the inking instead of the white of the book. And I usually do these edges as well. So that's the book we're working with, and we're going to use accordion folding technique to be the structure of the book. It's not going to be like a typical accordion fold book, but we're using that as the structure to add the pages to the book. And so what you want to do is you want to cut however many strips of paper. It just depends on how many pages you want in your book or how many will fit. And if you've ever done accordion folding before, like making domino books or other books that open up, there's a lot of measuring. You got to be sure it fits, and there's scoring and all this kind of stuff. You don't have to do any of that, because all we're interested in is having it so that it fits in here. It just has to be somewhat within the height of the book, because we're just using it as structure. These are not going to be the pages. The actual potions and things are going to be the pages. So we don't have to worry about that. We just make something that's smaller, so no crazy measuring and no crazy scoring and all that kind of stuff. And then we're just going to do simple fold, and I'll show you how to do that. Basically just fold it in half, and you want really sharp creases. And then you can fold it back on itself again. Really what I'm doing, I'm just going to fold it until I get small pages. Fold it again. So we've got this now. And let's fold it this way. And this is going to be the finished size of each of the folds. And then I've got this big place, let me fold it again. And it really doesn't matter which direction you go, just keep folding everything in half. Got this, I could go this way. So I say it's really easy, there's just no measuring to this. We need to put that in half again until we get small folds. Small, you know, they're not pages, but they will be pages. Now, you may have a situation where, well, you will, where you're going to have to put books together or put sections together, and you're just going to want to glue them together. And that's the beauty, is you can just do that. And if the fold doesn't go the right way, just reverse it. So here needs to go here, 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 here. You just can't go wrong. The only important thing to remember when you're connecting these is that you need to have an even number, not an odd number, because the ends are going to connect to the inside of the book. So when I say even number, I'm talking about this: 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14, 15, odd number. So this is odd man out. I need a piece that's like this. So I would cut this off. And then you've got an even number, and you've got these edges that will go against the inside of the book. Now I'm just going to tear this off for the purposes of this. Now the next thing you're going to do, which is different than you probably do in a cording fold book, is you're going to glue these together. So you're going to glue it like that, because we don't want this book that opens. We want something that looks like a real book, and how a real book would open with pages. So I'm just gluing these together. Think of it as the back side. I'm just doing this quickly so I can move on with showing you the next thing. Okay, so you've got these extra tabs here on the end. Think of them as your connector tabs, and here are your pages. And now what you want to do is decide where you're going to put the pages that you want to add, and we're going to be gluing them onto these. Think of them as tabs. So if I say, okay, I want this one on, I'm going to add my glue, and I'm going to put it in here. You know, I can kind of center it. It's more important that once, as you put the pages in, they all match. So I've got one page in, there it is on the back. Now when I add the next page to the back of this, I'm gluing it on top of everything. So I'm gluing it to that tab, and I'm also gluing it to the other page. So we have this. Of course, you're going to want to make sure everything lines up, and then you know you might want to ink the edges. So I've got that page in. So I keep doing that and just keep adding all my different pages. And you want to put some blank paper in there and add some other images, just whatever you want. So you can see how this is just the structure of the book. It's not actually an accordion fold. Again, add another page. Just keep adding and just make sure they're all lined up with each other. And when you get done at the end, this is all inked, you got all your pages ready to go, you are going to glue this into your book. You're going to glue this down on the front and this on the back cover, and you're going to glue your spine in. So you do want the book to be, whatever your spine is, you want it to sort of fill it out, because this is kind of shallow for this spine, it's kind of small. So even if you add a bunch of extra empty pages, whatever you do, just you want to make it so it doesn't have to fit tight. This one doesn't fit tight, but it pretty well fills it out. And then on the inside pages, you know, where you've put this tab, then you can just cut out something else and glue that in there to cover up that tab that you used to glue the inside book down. And so that's a simple way to make a real book. So since I'm making all the books, I figured I needed to make a book stand, and I was just kind of trying to figure out what I could use to create one. I decided, of course, I needed some kind of a podium or pedestal, and then, of course, I needed the shelf where the book would fit. And so I started with, at the top, you can see these are wooden candlesticks, and it was great because I had the hole in the top. And then this is just a Victorian shelf that's made out of chipboard. It comes in a little kit. It has the back scroll piece. It's got the shelf piece, and then it has two little bitty little scrolly things down below. And what I did was I decided, okay, I'm going to connect this shelf to the candlestick, but I want it to be slanted backwards at an angle. I don't want it to be flat because I want it that way the book sits on this book stand. And so I cut away, if you look at the lower left-hand picture of the Victorian shelf, you see little boxes, and that indicates the area that I cut away, so that the half rounded area, I trimmed some of that off because it was a little bit too big for the hole. And then the trim area down below, of course, I had to take that off, and also a little bit further past that circular area, so that all that would fit down into the hole, and then the other decorative work would be far enough away from the top of the candlestick so that that would all fit in. So I filled that hole with glossy accents, and then I stuck it down in there and let it dry, but I pushed it back at a little bit of an angle, and I think you can see that in the picture. So once I had the book stand assembled, I then spray painted it with a copper spray paint. That made it really easy, especially with all that detailed scroll work. And then I decided I had to jazz it up a little bit more, and I thought, well, I'll put some kind of neat steampunky looking thing on the front. And so I thought, well, if you had a book stand and you were looking at books or manuscripts or whatever, it might be nice to have some kind of magnifying gizmo that would move around and that you could move in front of whatever it is that you were looking at. And so that's what I came up with. And the idea behind this is that you're going to take some things and wedge them with other things on the outside so that they freely move on the inside. Instead of gluing one thing on top of another thing, I didn't do that. I stacked them instead and only applied glue to the very last thing that I put on. That way everything in the middle can move. So if you look at the row of pieces, that's the pieces I used to put this together, and it is in order of how I stacked it. And I started with, on the right is a gear, or left, excuse me, is a gear piece from a clock piece. And so it's got that big gear on it, so that acts as a stop when I stick the other pieces on. Then I've got a paper clip that I put on top of that. Then I have a gear. Then I have a clock hand, then another paper clip, and then another gear. Now, I didn't have to use both of those gears because the paper clip would have stayed on because of that first gear, that long gear. But I thought it looked better to have two gears, like one with, cutouts in it and a solid one. So that's why I used two gears. But you can put as much in there as you want. And then once I got that stacked, if you look on the right-hand side, you see I've got the whole stack there. Now I need to glue something on there to keep that pressed tightly together. So first thing I did was I added this just little round metal piece because the gear was there was still some of it sticking up and I needed to add more to it. So I glued that down on that copper colored gear, and then I needed something long because I got to have something to glue to the stand. And so I had this long bead with a hole that fit over that. So I glued that on top of that. So those are the only two things that are glued in this whole thing. I did use glossy accent, or not glossy accents, E6000. Anytime I've really got a tough job, I always use E6000. So now if you look down to the bottom, I attached my optometrist glass, and I just glued that inside onto the silver paper clip. And so since that paper clip moves, then the glass moves, and then the other paper clip will move, and the clock hand will move. And of course, you could stick some more stuff on the other paper clip if you wanted to. I thought about it, but I just kind of ran out of time. I was like, oh, I'll just have to go with this. So now I've got this whole gizmo together, and now I can attach that to my stand. Now here you can see the finished stand, and you can see my little gizmo is glued to the stand. Now I glued that long bead right in the center underneath the ledge, and of course E6000, and I let that dry quite a while. And so now it sits there and I can move all those things up and down. And then in the hole in the back, I thought, well, we need something a little more creepy. So I put eyeball back there and covered it with glossy accents. That eyeball will be on my blog for you if you want to download that. And it's actually the same eyeball I used for the dragon book. And then it's pretty sturdy, and it can hold, quite a bit. You see down below, I've got the eyeball book, which is pretty heavy with all that metal stuff on it. And then I've got two of the other faux books sitting on there. And actually with the thing tilting back, even though I have that heavy metal bit on the front, it is a counterbalance to the weight of the front. And that is something to consider. I mean, you don't want to go too crazy with making that thing so that it's so heavy that it just topples over. Now, if you're going to glue it down, then you don't care. But mine is actually free. It stands up free, and that's just enough to counterbalance it. And then, of course, if I put a little bit more weight on the books, then there's still enough weight in the front that it doesn't fall backwards. So that's the book stand. So with this apothecary, I decided I needed to scale, because if you're going to be mixing up potions, you might need to measure them. And so my first step was to create a base, and I stacked, I believe it was about 5 pieces of heavy chipboard on top of each other and glued them together. And then to dress it up, I took some filigree, this is a very soft filigree that's very easy to bend, and I bent it around the ends of the square base. But before that, though, I did cover it with the leather paper again, the faux leather paper, and then put those on. And then for the center, I used a watch piece. If you watched the Mad Scientist thing and you saw my eyeball creature, there was this watch or this clock piece in the middle. It's round, and it's got a protruding part that sticks up. I used another one of those for the base, because that gave me a nice area to start stacking things. And that's really what you want to do. You got to build that center section. You don't have to use what I use. You could use anything that's round and anything that's long for rod. So I just happen to have a lot of clock parts, and I like it to look a little steampunky, so that's what I do. So with the protruding part that you see in the middle, I stuck a gear down on that, so it sits all the way down on the bottom. And then I needed to start making that hole smaller for my rod to fit into it, so I put a smaller gear on top of the protrusion and glued it in place, and the hole is also smaller. And I just think it makes it more interesting if you just kind of create a lot of levels. Now, unfortunately, I lost a lot of the interim pictures that I took in putting this together, so hopefully I can make it clear how to do the rest of this. The next step is that I glued a rod into that base, and it was another clock part, but you could use a wooden skewer, anything that you might have that would create a rod. And so I glued that down in there, and then on the front of the rod, I didn't want to look at just an ugly rod, and I wanted to give it a little bit more pizzazz, so I glued a flat piece of filigree on the front of that rod. If you'll notice at the bottom of the base there too, there's another piece of filigree on the front, and I ended up adding that later because I was like, I need to do something on the front. So also notice that where you see step 3, the hole was still not small enough after I put that second gear on, so I ended up putting an even smaller gear to make that hole even smaller to better fit the rod. And then of course I shot a bunch of glossy accents down in there to hold that rod in place, because it wasn't 100% tight, but it was very close. So once I got all that rod in place, and put the filigree on, then I moved down. If you look at the very bottom here, I started working on the very top piece. Now that's the piece that's going to hold the scale itself. And so the first thing was I put a rondelle on top of the rod and glued it in place, because that's the stopper to keep everything from falling down the rod. Then the next thing I had to do is I used this hanging clip, and you can see the hanging clip on the rod, but you can also see another picture of these little clips. And it was really nice because it had a hole that could go over the rod, and then it had this little clip thing, and that I could put the chain could rest on. And it's got a little tongue in there too that I could lift up to keep the chain from slipping out. So this kind of ended up being a nice gizmo to do the scale part, and it comes out from the rod a little bit, so that way that whole mechanism is not sitting against the rod. So once I did that and got that hanging clip on there, and I did glue it in place on top of the rondelle, this particular watch piece had a little knob that screwed on the top, so that's what I used. But you could use any kind of bead you have, metal beads, anything that you have that you want, that's got a hole that you want to, you know, put on the top there. You don't have to have what I have. And then I decided just to dress it up a little bit more, and so I just put the little brass foot on the top for decoration, and I've used those before, and Alpha Stamps carries those. So that kind of built my top piece that everything's going to hang off of. The next step is to create the scale part, and these pictures show it hanging already, but you do not assemble it hanging. You want to build it by itself, and the last thing you do is hang it. So I'm starting with another rod, and I put some rondelles on the rod on the ends, not to the very end, a little bit in. Those are going to act as stops for all of the jump rings that we're going to have that handle all of the chain. So I put some jump rings in. I put the rondelles and glued them in place as the first step. Then I cut a piece of chain. That's going to be the top piece of chain, the part that goes through that clip. And this you're going to have to figure out how long it should be, because it depends upon how tall your center rod is, what you're using. So you want this to hang so that it's the bowls are not hitting the bottom. So you want the chain, you might have to hold it up with your rod and just kind of look at it and see, okay, if the chain goes through the clip and it's going to be this wide, then I need it to be this long so it holds it up high enough. And you put a jump ring on each side of that chain, and then you slip those jump rings onto the rod. And so you can see that in step 2, those are slipped on, and then don't glue them, just leave them how they are. And then you'll move to making the basket or the bowl mechanism. There, we're going to be working with 3 chains for each bowl. That's just a wooden bowl that I painted. And you're going to have 6 chains in all, 3 for each. And they're going to be separate lengths of chain. Again, you'll have to decide how long you want your chain to be, those chains. You want them obviously all the same. How long you want them to be so that the bowls hang at the right distance from the rod at the top. So for this, you're going to put on the one end, we're going to need to attach those chains to the bowl. So the way to do that, or the way I figured to do it, was with rondelles. So I took a rondelle and I attached a chain to the rondelle with a jump ring. Then I glued the rondelle onto the bowl, because I just found it was a pain. Once you get that thing glued to the bowl, if you start messing with it, trying to put a jump ring on it, trying to hook a chain to it, it'll just come off. So I did all the chain work first. And then once I got all the chains put together with the rondelles, and then of course the 3 chains need to come together into one jump ring. Once I got that all put together, then I glued each one of the rondelles onto the bowls. And again, I use glossy accents. The thing to be really careful of, though, is when you glue that rondelle on, don't glue where the hole is, where the jump ring is going through, because if that gets glued, it won't hang freely. So you're just trying to glue the bottom edge of it. And if you've got something else, you know, that's not a rondelle that would work for this purpose, it's just about finding things that work to do what you want to do. It's not necessarily about you got to use exactly what I used. So once I got the bowls all glued with their jump rings and rondelles, then I need to gather all 3 of the chains up and put all 3 chains on one jump ring. And once you have them on one jump ring, then you're going to slide them onto your rod right next to the other jump ring that's holding the main chain. And now you got to put something on the ends so that you keep those 2 jump rings from coming off. And so again, I put 2 more rondelles, rondelles on the ends of the rod to keep that from falling off. And you can see that kind of determines the distance, and all kind of determined where the first rondelle was going to be on the inside, how many I had the 2 jump rings. So I kind of put those things on the rod to figure out, okay, where do I need those stops on the middle? Because I don't want, I wanted everything out as far to the ends as possible, but to give me enough room for the jump rings and then to add that last rondelle on the end. So now that you've got that done, now you can go ahead and go to the next step and do the attaching of the whole mechanism to that clip. Now you can slip that main chain right inside where the clip is, and it will just slide right in. Now, there will be nothing to keep in your way. But the thing is, it will also fall right back out if you don't do something, if you move the thing around. So if you look at the second picture on the right, you can see that the red arrow is pointing to this tong. I have lifted that tong up. That tong would have been down right where the slit is. And so that's why it was easy just to put that chain on. But to make sure now that the chain doesn't fall off, I just lifted that tong, and now that chain's not going to come off even if it shifts around. Now, because the chain is just in that clip, it can easily move back and forth. So the picture at the bottom, you can see I've just kind of pulled the chain one way, so it looks like, you could put some stuff in your bowl and it would look like that's heavier than the other side. So that's how to make a scale. Crystal balls. I ended up making 2 different crystal balls. The first one's very simple. I used just feet. These are box feet that go, like if you wanted to put this at the base of a box or something, and they come in 4 and they just fit on the corners. So first I put them together and put some E6000 in between them, and they actually stand together, push together, just this how they're made. They just kind of do that naturally, but of course if you put something on them, they're going to fall apart. So I ended up putting the glue between, and then once that dried, I flipped it over and then put 2 little metal pieces underneath to be a support for that join in the middle, and that worked really well. And then as a stand, I used another one of those rods with the screw thing on the top, but this was a very short one. And then I needed more surface to glue that rod onto those feet, so I added a rondelle to that, so that gave me a flat surface that was much bigger. I glued that in the middle of the feet, and then I glued the big marble on top of that. And actually the top knob, it's actually concave on top of it, so it's not flat. So it was really nice because the crystal ball just sat right in that. And then there's holes in the feet, so I just took some metal beads and put them in the holes just to close those up. Now, the other crystal ball is a little bit more complicated, and it's kind of like the other things that I did where I've got the pieces laid out for you in order of assembly. The first one is a piece of filigree, and it's very bendable, so I kind of bent it so that it mounded up, so it gave it some height. And then to that I glued the puffy bead that you see there, and it's got a nice big hole, and I chose that because it's cool looking and my rod's going to fit in it. And then the next bead is, it's a round bead, but it's got these little protrusions at the top and bottom, which worked out nice because when I glued that on top of the puffy bead, that little protrusion went into the hole of the bead. And then of course another puffy bead, which sat on top of the protrusion on that bead. So I got that little stack going. And then I put the rod in. And then on top of the rod, you see the rod's got a fatter area and a skinnier area. So the skinny area went down into the top puffy bead and got glued in there, and then the very short end on the other areas where I ended up adding the other pieces. Now I wanted to suspend these hooks, and they come this way, these metal hooks, because I wanted my skulls to sit on those. So what I did was, if you look at the picture on the right where you see the top view, all that stuff is stacked up there. Then I stacked the filigree piece that you see in the picture with all the materials. Now that piece of filigree did not have a hole in it, but a lot of filigree is thin enough that if you have one of those big punches, you can punch a hole in that, and that's what I did. So I put that down first, and then I put the 2 swirl hooks on top of that, and you can see which end of those, the small end of those, I glued those right down on top of that. Once I did that, I was like, you know what, this thing's got to have more support. If I start putting things on here like those skulls, it's just going to lift those up. So I ended up putting a second piece of filigree with a hole in it, just like the first one, and put that on top of those 2 swirls, and that kind of had it sandwiched, those swirls sandwiched in between the 2 pieces of filigree so they wouldn't come off. And of course I used E6000 for all of that. And then, so now I've got my rod sticking up, and I wanted to put something else on there to have the bead or the big marble to connect to. So at the top of that, I put a rondelle again, just like I did before, and then the marble glues on top of that. And then the 2 skeleton heads, glue on each of those swirls. And it's very well supported. I think if you put something super heavy on each end, you might have a problem. And so you got this kind of weird, cool looking crystal ball. And then finally, here's some other odds and ends. I decided also to do something different with a candlestick, maybe something a little bit more steampunkish. And I decided as feet I would use pin nibs. And then in the core, I'm using gears and a little rod, and I don't know what these other little things are called, these little round, little tiny metal things. I chose them because if I tried to just glue the pin nibs against the big gear with all the ridges, there wouldn't be much surface to glue it to. So I'm using those small little metal pieces. They kind of fit right in the grooves, those little grooves, and I glued those in first. And then I glued the pin nibs on those little metal pieces, because the metal pieces, now I had more of a surface area. So that's how I did that. And then, so I started with gluing the little metal pieces on the big gear in the notches, and I used 5, so, you know, just kind of space them around. And there's 5 sections there, so that helps in the gear. And then once that dried with the E6000, then I glued all my pin nibs on, and then let that dry. And then after that, I put the little rod that's down there with the other little metal pieces, I put that in the center, glued that in, and then put the small gear on top of that and glued that in. And that's the surface the candles are on. And those are just birthday candles that I glued together, stuck on there, and burned a little bit. And they make birthday candles so well now, they hardly drip. So then I end up dripping a bunch more wax on it from another candle so that it gets this really messed up, gooky look. But I just thought, you know, that's a little cooler, different, more steampunky type of candlestick holder. Then at the bottom, there's a couple more odds and ends. I took a flower pot, a wooden flower pot, and glued some plastic skulls around the edge, and then painted the whole thing. And then in the Mad Scientist thing, I used ping pong balls to do make some of the equipment, and I still have a bunch of ping pong balls, so I cut it in half and used one half of it as a bowl that I painted, and those are little pumpkin pods in there. And then it's being held by 2 dragons. Those dragons, I think they're ceramic dragons. They are different colors, and it was kind of too colorful, so I ended up just painting them black, and then rubbing them with a little copper gilder's paste. And then you kind of see peeking out on the side, there's some scrolls that I made, and then I just rolled up some paper and put bead caps on each end, so that kind of dresses them up and makes them look a little bit more fancy. I hope you've enjoyed this tutorial and that I've given you some ideas for your projects. Other than the items from my stash, Alpha Stamps is carrying all the products that I used, as well as the new collage sheets for this project. If you want to see a lot more pictures and for the complete supply list, hop over to my blog using the link in the description area below. If you're on YouTube, if you're watching this from my blog, you're already there. And stay tuned, as I have more Halloween projects coming this season.